Let's play a game. I'm going to display a name of a country, and it'll be your job to think of what you associate with that country. Ready? Korea. But 9 out of 10 people's minds went there, and the 10th person doesn't know what the internet is. Let's try another one. Germany. Your mind probably went here, or here, or whatever the hell this is. Okay, one more. Vietnam. Huh. I detect a different theme, but why? Each of those countries was involved in a major war in the past century. So why does Vietnam get this treatment? Sure, you might also have associated Germany with Nazis or Korea with the DMZ, but you'd also think of Volkswagens, bratwurst, spicy barbecue, cell phones, Dennis Rodman. But with Vietnam, if not about the war, what else is Vietnam to us? Someone in a pointy hat working in a rice paddy? The Vietnam War ended in 1975, 40 years ago. Let that sink in for a minute. And yet when we see this, the tone and sentiment becomes this. But the question is why? Why do we as Americans have this universal reaction to this place called Vietnam? I'm driving around Westminster, California, and here Vietnam's influence is in the form of noodle shops, dental offices, and campaign posters. No mention of the war. But Westminster is unusual. It contains the largest diaspora of Vietnamese outside of Vietnam. So what will it take to bridge the gap between associating Vietnam with a B-52 and a bowl of pho? I decided to find out for myself. So a friend and I set off for Hanoi. Does this all seem a bit forced to you? The music that is seemingly in every Vietnam War movie ever made? I mean, I went to Vietnam in 2011. A more relevant song would have been... Party rock! Yeah. Kill that. Let's get oriented first. This is a map that Americans should be able to relate to. Vietnam is not a massive country, but it is quite long. This makes the use of horizontal space very difficult, and I apologize for the black edges. In the north of the country sits Hanoi, the country's capital. Roughly in the middle of the country is the ancient capital city of Hue and the beach town of Da Nang. In the southern part of the country is Ho Chi Minh City, which, for simplicity's sake, we'll just all call Saigon from now on. Southwest of Saigon is the Mekong Delta. Simple. Yes? Now, before we start, I need to admit that my travel companion and I have a keen interest in military history. I had read numerous uplifting textbooks during college, and have seen just about every war movie ever made about Vietnam.
Maybe it was a scout or something, sorry.
Yeah, sure, a scout.
I love the smell of napalm in the morning.
No, you see, you cannot put an elephant on an airplane.
But we weren't here to tour old battle sites. We wanted to see the country for what it is, and did our research accordingly. And equipped with this knowledge, we were off. When we arrived in Hanoi and explored early in the morning, we walked through a market area, where we stood out like sore thumbs. In fact, the entire morning we were the only foreigners in a 4-mile radius. While we got puzzled looks, nobody treated us rudely or yelled something about Yankee scum, as far as we could tell anyway. We eventually wound up at Hoan Kiem Lake, which is like a gathering spot for people to play cards, do stretching exercises, or dance. It's not. We also ended up seeing the waxy corpse of Ho Chi Minh himself. There's certainly no doubting that this country is very communist. We visited the famous Hoa Lo prison, better known as the Hanoi Hilton. Before I went, I had this idea that I would try and duplicate pictures taken during the war to see how much it had changed. The Hanoi Hilton is naturally a museum now, with a bookshop. The museum focuses mainly on the prisons used by the French, long before the Americans showed up. The American POW exhibit is in a small room, just reinforcing the unimportance of our involvement in the long history of Vietnam. The museum, of course, was also a lesson in propaganda, showing American POWs playing cards, eating cake, having a general good time, and describing their nearly decade-long imprisonment as temporary. As we explored Hanoi, snapping photos, it dawned on us that this wasn't a particularly pretty city. Kind of run down. But Hanoi was just one area of a very long country, and there were certainly more areas to explore. We took a shuttle bus from Hanoi to the coast and boarded one of the probably 100 similar-looking boats and began our tour of Ha Long Bay. Prior to doing my research, I had no idea that scenery like this even existed in Vietnam. This is our first exposure to other tourists. But one thing struck us as a bit odd. We encountered Australians, New Zealanders, Russians, British, even French tourists, but Americans, virtually none. There were vendors waiting for us at every stop with fruit, souvenirs, and small boat rides for a fee around the formations. Our tour of the bay ultimately ended in a place called Cat Ba Island, another destination I had never heard of until I looked through the travel guides. The guides said that services like internet would be difficult to acquire, but we found stronger signals on the island than in Hanoi, proving once again that even Lonely Planet doesn't know Vietnam. Our trip so far had been eye-opening, already proving wrong some expectations I had about the country. But now we took an overnight train to Hue City, in what was formerly South Vietnam. Again, I tried to replicate old photos, but this was becoming more difficult. During the Tet Offensive, this part of the city was hit hard. The ancient citadel had undergone renovations, but other parts of the city seemed to have changed radically. This was turning out to be rather confusing. It was a mix of old and new that mixed in a way that I had never seen before. And now we were off to Saigon, and it had a very different feel. Modern, fast-paced, almost European. Almost. When I tried to match photographs of old and new, like this iconic one from 1975 showing the evacuation of Saigon, I found the landscape had changed so much, I wasn't even sure which direction to point the camera. This is a city that didn't even resemble itself. As you've seen, I can't help but compare what I see to what I know about the war, because as an American, that's what I always associated with Vietnam. But now, having seen the changes, it's difficult to imagine a war ever taking place there. So it really got us thinking, how would we be received if we went to a historic site or museum dedicated entirely to the perceived communist victory over the United States? We got on a speedboat to head just outside Saigon to the town of Cu Chi, now infamous for its network of underground trails used by the Viet Cong. It was a strange atmosphere. Our guide had warned us that there was a video that didn't say nice things about Americans. But she continued by saying not to worry about it. It was all in the past. My friend and I only caught the end of the video, and we weren't so much offended as confused. The quality and editing of the video was just so bad, even worse than the one you're watching. The voiceover equally as ridiculous, that even the most fervent anti-American communist might find it over the top.
American bombs have ruthlessly decided to kill this gentle and small piece of countryside. in the south of Vietnam, thousands of miles away from USA. Like a crazy batch of devils, they fired into women and children. They fired into riverside chickens and ducks. They fired into greenery. They fired into the earth.
We were then shown the various types of traps used to ensnare passing soldiers. And then we're given the opportunity to both crawl through the tunnels themselves and fire an American weapon. This is all very strange. Almost like a war-themed carnival. And then we ventured down the Mekong Delta. I'm not sure exactly what we were expecting to happen, but it was nothing like it's portrayed in the movies. It just seemed like your standard fishing and farming communities supplemented with silly tourist activities, including, but not limited to, driving a boat, frying a fish, counting in Vietnamese, swinging in hammocks, feeding crocodiles, and wearing pointy hats. The Mekong Delta is something that gets dropped often when discussing the war, but no remnants of the conflict remain, just fish and fruit. And now we continue to cross the Gulf of Thailand to a place called Phu Quoc Island, a place I had never heard of until I saw it on a map and started doing research. This is like Hawaii, but without the high-rise hotels, the throngs of tourists, or chain restaurants. Okay, this is not like Hawaii. It was an isolated place with a few beachfront hotels, but barely any tourists on those beaches, with dirt roads connecting the different towns. For a country equated with a war, it was hard to find evidence of one ever existing. The few museums and sites that did exist were only frequented by foreign tourists, never Vietnamese. So as we watched our final sunset, we began to reflect on why we can't separate war from country. When I returned to the US, almost everyone asked the same questions. Did people treat you poorly? Did they give you dirty looks? In a word, no. It was like anywhere else. Some people are nice and some aren't. But being an American had nothing to do with how we were treated. In fact, judging by people's attire over there, looking American wasn't a bad thing at all. People would often approach us to practice their English or try to learn about us. Admittedly, some of these people were extremely drunk and literally jumped off a boat to talk to us and gaze at my friend's hilariously pale skin. But when they weren't looking for albinos or trying to sell us bananas, people wanted to know where we came from, what we did, and what we thought of Vietnam. In Saigon, there's a place called the War Remnants Museum, dedicated to the horrors of war, including Agent Orange, napalm, and B-52 bombing raids. And at this museum, in a communist country, an Agent Orange victim with no arms came up to me and expressed how he wanted to visit the US, and how grateful he was that I was visiting his country. No animosity whatsoever. But should that surprise me? I wasn't even born until 10 years, to the day, after this photo was taken during the final desperate hours of the evacuation of Saigon. But I wanted to find out if my experiences were the norm or the exception. A few months after being back from Vietnam, I drove down to Orange County to a war correspondence event. This was a chance to talk to people who saw Vietnam through a very different lens, and many of them had gone back since the war's end. I wanted to know from these correspondents who affectionately call themselves the old hacks why we cannot separate conflict from country.
It was a war, but basically it was a war that the Americans lost.
Well, I think Vietnam is a buzzword here for things that can go wrong.
You see, you're too young to remember this, but you know, when soldiers came back from the Vietnam War, when reporters came back, photographers came back from the Vietnam War, nobody really wanted to talk about it. It was sort of a forgotten war because in the eyes of the United States, it wasn't a successful war. I don't think the American public really focused on it until some of the big movies started coming out. Apocalypse Now.
Apocalypse Now, Platoon, and a slew of other movies that would never get nominated for Feel-Good Movie of the Year. Intensely psychological in theme and dark in tone. Mostly.
No!
Maybe it was Hollywood's dark depiction of the war that led to such negative connotations. To further this, the most lasting photographs taken during the war are just as haunting. Photographer Nick Ut, who was born in Vietnam and working for the Associated Press in 1972, took this picture of what came to be known as Napalm Girl. Given the horrors of images like these, I was hoping he could shed some light on Vietnamese attitudes about the war.
You know, a lot of Vietnamese today, you know nothing about war. They born after 75. You ask them about a picture, they say you don't know. You know, they restore in the Kun, they say about American war in Vietnam. They see all the pictures. My Lai massacre, the picture Napalm, they know the picture. But they talk about war, but it's too young.
Such a tremendous percentage of the population of Vietnam is now and was then born after the war. So they really have no memories of what happened. It's history.
And that's a far cry from the legacy it left in the United States. It was divisive 4 decades ago, and it still is today. Just look at the last few presidential campaigns.
John Kerry has not been honest about what happened in Vietnam.
I'm trying to stop the wars, but at least, you know, I went when they called me.
In the last election in 2008, Senator John McCain made his own heroic ordeal as a POW in Vietnam the basis of his campaign.
Those who suggest that Afghanistan is another Vietnam.
So we continue to talk about Vietnam, but it's a Vietnam that doesn't exist anymore.
Now I go back and I marvel at how much it's changed in the past 6 months.
Every year different. I come back and say, wow, this is like Las Vegas. Every time they make a new hotel, new house.
I got to see my old apartment building before it was torn down and turned into a shopping mall.
You know, another skyscraper's been put in, or another expressway. The country's developing so rapidly now.
But I got lost when I go to Vietnam. I cannot find where my family home. I got lost, unbelievable, because I look at the old house and new building behind.
And while all of this rapid change is taking place, Vietnam has a ways to go. Like many developing nations, there's a small fraction of the country that's driving around in luxury cars, while the remainder are lucky if they make $10 a day. But the question is, are we, as Americans, making any strides to seeing Vietnam differently? In the last few years, Americans have once again had Vietnam brought to their TV sets, but rather than this, they saw this.
I have 11 girls left. I've never been to Vietnam. I can't wait to see what this country has in store for me.
I don't even have to imagine my wife shaking her head in tears looking at this as her new home. What the hell that is? I want that. That, and a pony. A magical pony.
Cộng sản Việt Nam vinh quang, ánh sáng soi đường đưa ta về chiến thắng.
It's like One Direction.
Tự do.
Love your work. Is that a smoking jacket?
Is that a mod cut?
Oh yeah, full Phil Daniels. You check out the lining.
Admittedly, these shows aren't really portraying an accurate view of the country either, but at least it's different imagery than Americans have been accustomed to seeing. Here we are, 40 years later, and at a crossroads. On one hand, we don't want to forget our memories of Vietnam as a war, to honor those who fought, and maybe even learn from our past mistakes. But there is a difference between remembering and dwelling. By refusing to open our minds to what else Vietnam has to offer, one has to wonder what other countries are getting unfair treatment. And ultimately, what else are we missing out on?
There's something happening here. What it is ain't exactly clear. There's a man with a gun over there, telling me I got to beware. I think it's time we stop. Children, what's that sound? Everybody look what's going down. There's battle lines being drawn. Nobody's right if everybody's wrong.